You need to understand something about the bells before I tell you why they ring. My name is Samuel, and I was the groundskeeper of St. Agnes for 37 years. That is not a job you take. It is a job that takes you. You wake up one morning, and the old groundskeeper is dead, and the deacon looks at you because you are the only person in the congregation who knows how to fix the boiler and is too stubborn to say no. So you stay. And you stay. And after a while, the church is not a place you work. It is a place you live. And for 37 years, I lived with the bells. Every night at 3:17 in the morning, they rang. Not the full carillon, not the joyful announcement of Sunday worship. It was a single note. One bell. The smallest one, up in the tower. It would sound once, clear and cold, and then nothing. Silence so complete that the ring felt like a memory more than a sound. I asked about it my first week. The old deacon, a man named Harold who had been at St. Agnes since before the pews were bolted down, told me not to worry about it. Mechanical quirk, he said. Old systems do old things. But I was a groundskeeper. I knew old systems. And I knew that no bell, no matter how worn, rings itself at the same minute every night for 40 years without a reason. Harold died 6 months later. Heart attack in the rectory. And I was alone with the bells. For the first few years, I tried everything. I had a clockmaker come from the city, a man who restored church towers in Europe. He spent 3 days in the belfry, took apart the mechanism piece by piece, cleaned every gear, oiled every spring. He told me it was impossible. The system was manual, he said. No timer, no automation, nothing that could strike a bell at a scheduled hour. Someone would have to pull the rope. But there was no one in the tower at 3:17 in the morning. I checked. I started staying awake, sitting in the nave with a cup of coffee, listening to the silence build until the bell cut through it. And every time, I would walk to the tower door, climb the stairs, and find nothing. Dust. Cobwebs. The old rope hanging still. I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself for 20 years. Then the girl came. Her name was Emily, and she was 14 years old, and she showed up at the rectory door on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She was not from the town. She had walked 14 miles, she said, because her grandmother had told her before she died that the bells at St. Agnes would tell her the truth about her mother. I almost sent her away. That is the part one have to live with. I almost looked at this child, this tired, hollow-eyed child, and told her to go back to wherever she came from. But she said something that stopped me. She said her grandmother had died at 3:17 in the morning, and the last thing she ever said was listen for the bell. I made her tea. I sat her down in the vestibule, and I told her what I knew, which was nothing. I told her about the bell, about the 40 years, about the clockmaker and the impossible mechanism and the rope that moved without hands. And I watched her face change. Not fear. Recognition. She asked if she could stay the night in the church. I said no. She asked again. I said no again. Then she asked if I had ever been in the tower at 3:17 when the bell rang. And I had to tell her the truth. No. I had always climbed the stairs after. Always after. Because some part of me, some deep and cowardly part, did not want to be there when it happened. She asked me to be braver than I had been. That night, we sat in the tower. Not at the top, not in the belfry. Just at the base of the stairs, where the stone was cold and the air smelled of old wood and older dust. I brought a flashlight. She brought nothing. She just sat with her hands in her lap, waiting. The bell rang at 3:17, and for the first time, I was close enough to feel it. Not just hear it. Feel it. The vibration traveled down through the stone, through the floor, through my bones. And then I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming down the stairs from the belfry. I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, and there was no one there. But the footsteps did not stop. They passed us. They passed so close that the air moved. And then they continued down into the basement, where the old crypt was, where the first families of the town had been buried before the cemetery was built on the hill. Emily stood up. She did not look at me. She followed the sound. I followed her, because I was afraid to be alone, and I was more afraid to let a child walk into the dark by herself. The basement stairs groaned under our weight. The flashlight picked out the old stone markers, names worn smooth by 100 years of damp. And at the far wall, where the crypt ended, there was a door I had never seen before. It was small, child-sized, iron, rusted shut. But the lock was new, a padlock, gleaming, with a key still in it. Emily turned the key. The door swung open, and inside was a room no bigger than a closet. There was a cot, a table, a single photograph, yellowed and cracked, of a woman holding a baby. And on the wall, scratched into the stone with something sharp, were the same 4 words over and over and over again. I am still here. I found out later, from the old records in the diocese, that the room had been built in 1923. It was called a prayer cell, a place for a nun to retreat from the world, to live in silence and contemplation. But no nun had been assigned to St. Agnes in 80 years. The last one, a young woman named Sister Mary Catherine, had arrived in 1942 and disappeared 6 months later. The church records said she had transferred to a convent in Ireland. But there was no record of her arrival in Ireland. There was no record of her anywhere after 1943. Emily looked at the photograph. She turned it over. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written a name, Margaret, and a date. And then, in different handwriting, a single sentence. She never stopped ringing the bell. I do not know how to tell you what happened next. I do not know how to explain the rest of that night, or the years that followed. I only know that Emily took the photograph, and she walked out of the basement, and she never came back to St. Agnes. And the bell never rang again. Not once. Not at 3:17. Not at any hour. I stayed another 17 years as groundskeeper, and I listened every single night, and the tower was silent. People asked me why. They asked me what I had seen, what I had found, what changed. I never told them. Not because I was protecting the church. Not because I was ashamed of my cowardice, though I was. I did not tell them because I did not know how to say that a dead woman had been ringing a bell for 40 years to keep a promise to a child she would never meet. Margaret was Emily's grandmother. I learned that later. Margaret was the baby in the photograph. And Sister Mary Catherine, the young nun who disappeared, was her mother. She had hidden her daughter in the prayer cell to protect her from something I still do not fully understand. And when they took her away, when they sent her somewhere else or worse, she had climbed into the belfry one last time and tied the rope to her own wrist. So that every night at 3:17, the hour her daughter was born, she could pull it. Just once. Just enough to say, I am still here. 40 years. Until a girl walked 14 miles to hear the truth about her mother. And the bell finally stopped. You will not find St. Agnes on a map anymore. The diocese closed it 5 years ago. The tower is still there though. And sometimes when I drive past on a quiet night, I slow down and I roll the window down and I listen. There is nothing to hear. The bell is silent. The rope hangs still. But I know that somewhere, in a place that does not appear on any map, a woman is holding her daughter. And the only sound is the wind through the empty belfry, and the quiet of a promise finally kept. So when you hear a bell in the middle of the night, do not be afraid. Just ask yourself who is still trying to come home, and whether anyone is left to listen.